A funeral is supposed to be the safest place in the underworld. No business, no vendettas, no sudden moves, just respect, tradition, and silence. But on the 9th of February 1962, the funeral of Lucky Luciano was anything but safe. It was the largest gathering of criminal power America had seen in a generation. Thousands of mourners, every major family represented, law enforcement watching from a distance, and history quietly waiting to choose its next direction. On the surface, it looked like an ending. In reality, it was an opening. Luciano hadn't just been a boss. He had been the architect of order, the man who replaced chaos with structure and turned street gangs into a system. With his death, that system lost its original anchor. And whenever power loses its anchor, it becomes dangerous, especially in public. Everyone who mattered understood this, even if no one said it out loud. The funeral wasn't just about honoring the past. It was about signaling the future. That future appeared to have a face. Carlo Gambino was chosen to speak, a gesture heavy with meaning. In the Mafia world, nothing that visible is accidental. Standing at Luciano's funeral wasn't just an honor, it was a declaration. Gambino was being presented as continuity, as stability, as the man who would quietly carry the system forward, and that made him a target. What most people saw that day was ceremony. Black coats, cold air, controlled movements. What they didn't see was the tension underneath, the kind that only exists when too many rivals share the same space. Fewer still noticed the man who wasn't watching the casket, wasn't watching Gambino, and wasn't impressed by tradition at all, because Bumpy Johnson wasn't there to mourn. He was there to read the room. Bumpy understood something the others didn't. When power gathers in one place, violence doesn't announce itself, it hides. And sometimes the most dangerous moment isn't when a gun is raised, but when everyone assumes no one would dare to raise one. That morning in Queens, while the underworld focused on who was being buried, Bumpy Johnson focused on what was about to happen. For decades, Lucky Luciano had been more than a crime boss, he was the structural glue of the American underworld. His greatest achievement wasn't dominance, but design. He replaced endless blood feuds with a framework that rewarded patience over impulse and negotiation over chaos. By creating the commission, Luciano turned organized crime into something dangerously efficient, a system that could absorb ambition without tearing itself apart. As long as he was alive, even in exile, that system still had a center of gravity. That gravity vanished the moment he died. Luciano's death didn't trigger immediate violence because the men at the top were disciplined enough to wait. But waiting is not stability, it's compression. Pressure builds silently when a symbol disappears. Old grudges resurface. Forgotten ambitions regain oxygen. Everyone starts recalculating where they stand in a hierarchy that suddenly feels negotiable. The funeral, therefore, wasn't about grief. It was about measurement. Who would step forward, who would stay quiet, and who would test the boundaries Luciano once enforced by his mere existence. Public rituals matter in the Mafia because they broadcast legitimacy. Being seen in the right place, at the right time, sends messages no meeting ever could. That's why the choice of speaker at Luciano's funeral carried more weight than any announcement. When Carlo Gambino was positioned at the center of the ceremony, it signaled continuity, calm, control, a reassurance that the machine Luciano built would keep running without interruption. To most observers, it looked like the safest possible outcome. But safety is not how ambitious men read situations like this. To those who had been sidelined by Luciano's decisions decades earlier, the funeral represented a final insult. It wasn't enough that they had lost power while Luciano lived. Now they were expected to accept his chosen successor publicly, permanently, and without resistance. In the underworld, that kind of expectation creates a specific temptation. If legitimacy is being handed out in the open, then disrupting the moment can delegitimize everything that follows. That's what made the funeral uniquely dangerous. Not because violence was expected, but because it was forbidden. When everyone believes a line won't be crossed, crossing it becomes exponentially more effective. One act could shatter the illusion of order Luciano spent his life constructing. One disruption could force the families back into a state of uncertainty where raw power mattered more than consensus. Most men in attendance sensed the tension, but they interpreted it emotionally as nerves, tradition, superstition. Only a few understood it structurally. They recognized that Luciano's funeral wasn't the end of an era. It was the moment when the restraints came off, and the system he designed would either adapt or expose its weakest point in front of everyone. By 1962, Vito Genovese was physically removed from the streets, locked behind federal walls, and officially stripped of authority. On paper, his power was finished. But the Mafia has never measured influence by proximity. Distance doesn't weaken control when loyalty, resentment, and unfinished business continue to circulate freely. If anything, prison refined Genovese's perspective. He could no longer compete openly, so every move had to be irreversible. Genovese had spent his entire career orbiting Lucky Luciano's shadow. When Luciano chose others, first Frank Costello, then indirectly Carlo Gambino, Genovese internalized it as theft, not succession. To him, power had been denied, not earned. That belief hardened over years, transforming patience into obsession. By the time Luciano died, Genovese wasn't interested in reclaiming authority. He wanted to invalidate the process that had excluded him. The funeral presented a rare opportunity. It gathered every rival, every witness, and every symbol in one confined space. More importantly, it was public. Violence there wouldn't just remove Gambino, it would discredit the very idea of orderly succession. The message would be unmistakable. The system Luciano built could not protect its chosen heir, even on its most sacred day. That kind of disruption doesn't need to succeed perfectly. It only needs to happen. What made Genovese's position dangerous was precisely his lack of downside. Already imprisoned, he had nothing left to lose by destabilizing the city he could no longer control. If Gambino died, the resulting chaos would weaken every family at once, creating fractures Genovese's remaining loyalists could exploit. And if the attempt failed, the blame would be difficult to trace back to a man already behind bars. It was asymmetrical warfare, played through proxies who were disposable by design. From the outside, it seemed irrational, risking exposure, provoking law enforcement, inviting retaliation. But Genovese wasn't playing for longevity, he was playing for relevance. In the Mafia world, being remembered as the man who broke the system can matter more than being excluded from it. The funeral wasn't a chance to win power. It was a chance to deny it to everyone else. Most of the men attending sensed none of this. They saw Genovese as neutralized, contained, no longer a variable worth calculating. That assumption was their blind spot, because power doesn't disappear when a man is locked away. It concentrates, and in 1962, that concentration was aimed directly at the moment when New York's underworld thought it was most protected by tradition, by ritual, and by the memory of the man who used to hold it all together. Inside the chapel, every important figure in the American underworld was focused on the same thing: Carlo Gambino. How he walked, who stood near him, whether he looked calm or guarded. In moments like this, Mafia power is read through posture, proximity, and confidence. Most of the men present believed the danger, if it existed at all, would come after the funeral later that night, or weeks down the line. Ritual, after all, was supposed to create immunity. Standing well outside that logic was Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy didn't study Gambino. He studied movement. He watched who arrived alone, who avoided eye contact, who entered too early or too late. He paid attention to the margins, the people who didn't quite belong but weren't challenged either. Years in Harlem had taught him a simple rule: When something violent is being planned, the planners never look nervous, the men around them do, and funerals were perfect camouflage. Grief explains tension, crowds explain confusion, silence explains hesitation. Unlike the Italian bosses, Bumpy had no stake in succession. He didn't care who replaced Luciano. What he cared about was what kind of war would follow if the transition collapsed in public. Harlem sat between territories, money flows, and political fault lines. A full-scale mob conflict wouldn't stay confined to Italian neighborhoods. It would spill outward, drag in street crews, invite police crackdowns, and turn neutral ground into contested ground. For Bumpy, this wasn't about loyalty to Gambino. It was about containment. That's why he didn't warn anyone openly. An explicit warning would force action bodyguards tightening ranks, nervous movements, sudden changes. That kind of reaction exposes fear, and fear invites mistakes. Instead, Bumpy treated the threat like a structural problem, not an emergency. He focused on reducing the ability to act, not confronting the intention to act. In his world, the most effective way to stop violence wasn't to challenge it head-on, but to quietly remove its timing, its positioning, and its certainty. While others relied on tradition to keep them safe, Bumpy relied on asymmetry. He knew that anyone planning violence at a funeral was counting on two things: predictability and restraint. Predictable seating, predictable routes, predictable behavior. Break those assumptions subtly enough, and the plan collapses under its own weight without anyone ever realizing why. So, as Luciano's name echoed through the chapel and history seemed to pause in respect, Bumpy Johnson was already thinking past the ceremony. Not about who would speak next, but about who would fail to act and why. In the underworld, that difference is everything. When the service finally began, everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to. The chapel was full. The atmosphere was heavy, but controlled. Carlo Gambino took his place without incident, surrounded by familiarity, not panic. To anyone inside, it felt like the system was working ritual, holding chaos at bay, tradition doing its job. That was the illusion everyone needed to believe in, and it was precisely why nothing happened. Plans that rely on shock depend on timing more than courage. The longer a violent moment is delayed, the more fragile it becomes. Uncertainty creeps in. Signals don't line up. Positions feel wrong. At Luciano's funeral, the opportunity never crystallized. The crowd was too dense. The spacing felt off. The moment that was supposed to open a door instead kept closing it. What should have been a clean strike turned into a series of missed alignments no one could explain. From the outside, the calm looked like respect. From the inside, it felt like hesitation. Those who had come prepared to act found themselves surrounded by too many variables, too many witnesses, too much attention from the wrong angles. And once doubt enters a plan built on coordination, it collapses silently. No shots were fired because firing would have achieved nothing. Violence without certainty doesn't assert power, it exposes weakness. In that space, restraint wasn't mercy. It was survival. Outside the chapel, Bumpy Johnson didn't celebrate. He didn't signal success. He simply observed the most important outcome of all. Nothing escalated. The absence of chaos was the result. No bodies meant no retaliation. No retaliation meant no justification for expansion, revenge, or emergency alliances. The system remained intact not because it was strong, but because someone had quietly denied it a reason to break. That denial mattered more than any public victory. A failed assassination that leaves no trace is worse than a public one. There are no martyrs, no rallying cries, no enemies to point at, just suspicion and silence. The men who came expecting history to turn instead walked away, unsure of what had stopped them. And uncertainty is corrosive inside criminal organizations. It breeds fear inward, not outward. When the mourners dispersed and the streets returned to normal, something fundamental had shifted. Not in headlines, not in speeches, but in understanding. The funeral had proven that even at the most symbolic moment imaginable, violence could be neutralized without confrontation. And once that lesson is learned, it changes how power is exercised forever. Nothing was announced after Lucky Luciano was laid to rest. There were no public acknowledgments, no visible shifts in leadership, no sudden outbreaks of violence that would have signaled a power struggle narrowly avoided. And that was precisely the point. In the Mafia world, the most important outcomes are often the ones that never become official, because they don't need to be. They are understood. Carlo Gambino left the funeral alive, but more importantly, aware. He didn't need a briefing to know that something had intervened. The danger he felt walking in never materialized, not because it wasn't real, but because it had been neutralized before it could take shape. Gambino was a man who survived by reading absence as carefully as presence, and the absence of violence at Luciano's funeral told him one thing with absolute clarity. Someone had decided the war would not be allowed to start. That realization changed how Gambino saw Harlem. For years, Harlem had been treated as an adjacent world close enough to affect business, distant enough to ignore politically. After the 9th of February 1962, that was no longer possible. Bumpy Johnson had demonstrated something far more threatening than force. He had shown that he could influence outcomes at the highest level without asking permission, without leaving fingerprints, and without demanding recognition. In organized crime, that combination commands respect faster than any show of violence. On the other side of the equation, Vito Genovese lost his final lever of disruption. The failure at the funeral didn't just preserve Gambino's position, it exposed the limits of Genovese's reach. If even a moment as symbolically perfect as Luciano's burial couldn't be turned into chaos, then the system he wanted to burn down was more resilient than he'd believed. From that point forward, his influence diminished not through confrontation, but through irrelevance. What emerged in the weeks that followed was not an alliance, but an understanding. Harlem would remain independent. The Italian families would respect its boundaries, and in return, the stability that had been preserved that day would not be challenged from the outside. No contracts were signed, no words were exchanged in public, but the lines were drawn all the same. That was the true legacy of Luciano's funeral. Not the man who was buried, and not even the man who spoke, but the fact that New York's underworld quietly accepted a new reality. Power no longer belonged exclusively to those who held titles. It belonged to those who could stop history from taking the path everyone else expected and walk away without needing credit for it. When the last car left the cemetery and the crowds faded back into New York, nothing about the city looked different. There were no sirens, no headlines, no visible scars. Lucky Luciano had been buried with full honors, and the system he created appeared to move forward exactly as planned. But appearances have always been the Mafia's favorite disguise. What mattered wasn't what happened that day, it was what didn't. A public assassination would have rewritten history in blood. It would have forced sides, triggered retaliation, and pulled Harlem into a war it never asked for. That outcome never came, not because the danger wasn't real, but because someone refused to let the moment become what it was designed to be. Bumpy Johnson didn't step into the spotlight, didn't claim credit, and didn't demand acknowledgement. He did something far more effective. He ensured that the future stayed predictable. For Carlo Gambino, survival that day meant more than living through a ceremony. It meant understanding a new boundary. Power in New York no longer flowed in a single direction, and stability depended on respecting forces that didn't wear Italian names or sit at formal tables. The lesson was absorbed quietly, the way all lasting lessons in organized crime are. Luciano built a system to end wars. On the day he was buried, That system was tested at its most vulnerable moment, and it held, not because of loyalty or fear, but because someone outside it chose restraint over spectacle. That choice reshaped the map without drawing a single line on paper. History remembers the men who rise and fall. It rarely remembers the ones who prevent collapse. But in the underworld, those are the names that matter most. Because real power isn't proven by the chaos you unleash. It's proven by the disaster you stop without anyone ever knowing how close it came.